Excellent. Well, thank you so much and enjoy today's session.
Thank you. Can everybody confirm that they are able to see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And you see just the main screen, right? Not my
Yeah, no window screen, no desktop.
perfect. I'm trying to move things around on my screen because I'm the presenter and I'm also the host, so I have to let people in, and so I'm just going to manage all of this stuff right now. Okay, so thank you all for being here. I know it is right before the holidays, so it's kind of one of those days where it's like you don't really want to do anything, but we're just going to try to power through it. So today is the second session for our data privacy series, and it is the last of the entire RCLS cybersecurity awareness training for this year. So I want to thank everybody who has jumped on either live or virtually through the recorded session. We really appreciate everybody participating. And of course, y'all know it's a super important topic for me. If you can put your camera on, that would be awesome. It's a small group, so it just helps me to have some feedback to make sure everybody's like on the same page and I'm not putting anybody to sleep. If I put you to sleep, just open up the mic and say, hey, like you need to be more energetic, but I don't think you're going to say that about me. If you need to ask questions, I have the chat open, ask them in the chat. However, if for some reason I miss it, it is a small group. Please feel free to unmute yourself. But I will stop every couple of slides just to kind of go through everything. But stay muted until such time. That way we don't have to worry about there being any kind of interference. And of course, have fun. That's always a big deal. Oh, I've got to let somebody in here. Okay. So if you've seen these already, I apologize. It'll probably be the 8th time for some of you, but I guess I'm going to do the really abridged version today because I think after 8 times you can go and find the full introduction on one of the other videos. But I have been in the security industry for over 20 years, and I started out in physical security. That's a picture of me up on the Statue of Liberty. I migrated to kind of straddle the physical cybersecurity industry about 4 or 5 years ago, and went back to school to get my master's in cyber policy and risk analysis. And that really was the driving force behind the passion of me creating my consultancy, because I recognized the importance of teaching and educating people on all the topics within cybersecurity, and having the opportunity to be with RCLS and present on all of these topics has been really an honor, because it is something that's really important, and organizations like libraries and schools, I think, are extra vulnerable because oftentimes they don't necessarily have the resources that the larger companies have to protect their data. And so the fact that everybody's joining and are watching these recorded really is a testament to how everybody is becoming more and more aware and kind of committed to that. So I appreciate it. I have 2 incredible children. One, the younger one, which is the one in the cowboy hat, he's in Pine Bush. He's in 11th grade. He also participates in the career technical program, the welding program through BOCES. My oldest son is a computer science major with a cyber minor at Fordham University. He currently is participating in the Air Force ROTC and is actually on track, fingers crossed, to commission after graduation to Space Force, which is super, super exciting, because I always joke around and say that I want to be him when I grow up. It's a huge opportunity for him to kind of get into protecting our nation through cyber offensive tactics. It's pretty impressive. And then, of course, I have my fur baby, Avery, and he's just, he's 7. He'll be 8 actually in January. And he's kind of the spoiled little brat of the family. I recently wrote a book, and it has been published. It is available on Amazon. It's called The Digital Citizen's Guide to Cybersecurity. And the goal of the book is to really be a very non-technical, anecdotal account of different things that we can do, conversations we should be having with everyone from age 12 to 100 around keeping ourselves and educated and safe online, right? Being informed about what the risks and dangers are, and then also what are the things and actionable things that we can do on a daily basis that will help us to be safe. Right? And so the key for that book really is empowerment. I know that people are going to continue to engage online increasingly more and more. And if we're going to do that, then we also need to provide tools for people to protect themselves, especially children and the elderly, because the elderly seem to be targeted as well. So if you're interested, it is available. If you could just take a moment and type into the chat what your role is within the library that you're with, so that I can just have an idea. Most of you I've kind of seen before, I believe, but just in case. So that helps me. I apologize. I'm just gonna. Phone is off. Awesome. Okay, so we kind of have a range of all different responsibilities, which is great, because I love to be able to kind of apply this to, I apologize, I'm getting a spam call that they are just relentlessly calling and hanging up. Head of adult services, circulation, and director. Okay, so you don't necessarily need to have watched the first part, but I do encourage you, if you haven't seen part 1, to go back and check that one out, because we kind of went through a really granular look at data privacy, data classification. We went through the anatomy of a privacy policy, which is really important. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about, well, we'll review some of those things, but then I wanted to talk about cybersecurity and privacy risk relationships, data protection versus data privacy, because in the policy world, there are two different things, data protection policy versus a data privacy policy. And then I wanted to kind of finish it out with, it's all about trust, right? And so what we do with people's data really is relying on the fact that we create an environment of trust. Okay, just want to make sure there's nobody in the waiting room. Nope, we're good. Okay, so this is a review. If you were in the first session, it's the same exact slide. What is data privacy? So in the library setting, user privacy is the right to open inquiry. And I took this, by the way, directly out of the American Library Association, is the right to open inquiry without having the subject of one's interest examined or scrutinized by others. This includes library materials consulted, borrowed, or acquired by the data subject. What makes it very unique, this definition of user privacy, is that it extends the definition of data privacy beyond the traditional definitions that we see in most of the laws and regulations. Because typically, data privacy is associated to unique identifiers about a data subject, right? So when we look at these privacy terms, and again, we talked about this in the past, but I just want to kind of rehash a little bit about it. So the data subject is the individual person who can be identified directly or indirectly by an identifier. In the case of libraries, the scope actually grows a little bit larger than that, because it's not just about unique identifiers, but it's about the information that they are searching or services that they're acquiring, right? So it does, build out a little bit on what the traditional definition of data privacy is. So typically data privacy is constructed around personally identifiable information. Within that, you also get something called personal health information, which is PHI. But essentially, it's a unique data set that could potentially identify a specific individual. And that differs from personal information, because personal information is information that could be shared with others, but it kind of, in total, creates a profile or a persona about the person. It includes likes, dislikes, preferences. So if you combine personal information with private information, it becomes really powerful, right? And it could be used in all sorts of ways. Data monetization is a big one, where data brokers will take this information, package it together, and then sell it to various organizations. Usually it's being sold for the purpose of advertising or whatever, but sometimes can be also sold to adversaries and criminal actors that will use that information to target people specifically for criminal activity. The data controller is the person or entity that determines the purposes for which that and the means by which the PII is processed. So in the case of the library, for example, the library director may be considered the data controller, where that's the individual who is going to make the decisions about what information is being collected and how that information is being used. And then the data processor is the computer or person, or it could be an entity that carries out operations on the data that's retrieved, transformed, or classified information. So the data processor processes the information on behalf of the data controller. And why is this important? This is important because there's a relationship between the data controller and the organizations that process the data. Now, they might be internal organizations, but in the case of the library, it's traditionally going to be vendors or suppliers of services that you're using outside of the scope of the services that the library has. So we really need to remember there's due diligence and due care that has to happen in that vendor relationship. And we talked about that a little bit more in depth in the previous session. So if you want to learn more about that, go back and review the first part of this two-part session. I don't want to go too deep into it because we already talked about it, but in order to protect the data and maintain data privacy, your privacy policy for a data subject, if you're using third-party vendors, that relationship between the controller and the data processor needs to be locked down pretty tightly. In the case of New York State, specifically around education, they have very new rules and laws through Ed Law 2D, where the privacy policies of third-party vendors has to be linked back on the school's websites. And I don't think that applies specifically to libraries, but it is an interesting idea that they are having these privacy policies with these third-party vendors being made available to the parents and students online, so that they understand who the vendors are and how their data is being used and protected. Does anybody have any questions about any of that? Okay. So today I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about regulations around data privacy. We didn't get too much into that last session. We did talk about classifying data and understanding the types of data that we collect. But one of the really challenging things that we face in the United States is the fact that we don't have an overarching privacy regulation that really dictates how data can be collected, when they could be collected, what the rights of the data subject are, and all those things, and the roles and responsibilities within the organization collecting the data. Instead, we have federal regulation that is predicated based on the protection of data classes or the protection through data uses. So it's very specific to the type of data and then how it's being used. So for example, I just listed a few, and there's quite a few, but I just listed some. They were maybe ones that you've heard about. So for financial information, for example, if you use a processed credit card information, you are being regulated by PCI DSS, which is the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. And under PCI DSS, there are very strict rules about what you can and can't do with credit card information and how you process it. Personal health information, everybody's familiar with the HIPAA regulation, which is the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act. And that dictates specifically what you can do with PHI. And then we've got COPA and FERPA, and those kind of really focus around children, right, under the age of 13, and what we can and can't do with children's information online under the age of 13. And then when we look at data uses, still relating to finance, we have, the FCRA, which is the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So now we're talking about what information can and can't be listed on a credit report and who has access to that information. There are rules and regulations on the use of telecommunications and direct marketing, on the do not call list and what that means. And then of course, the use of email addresses for spam, and that regulation is called CAN-SPAM. So when we look at that in contrast to Europe, for example, or the EU has GDPR, and that regulation covers all European citizens, and it really dictates and provides guidelines as to what can and can't be done with the data subject's information, and then takes it a step further and gives the user the right to do a whole bunch of things, like the right to be forgotten, the right to know how their data is being used. And it goes all the way down even into things like video surveillance. If an EU subject is being video surveilled for some reason, they can actually go in and request that that organization take out all instances where that person was on the security cameras. It's actually a lot of responsibility on the part of the organizations that are collecting data. And they do it purposefully, right? Because they want to make sure that the principles of privacy are being upheld and that data is not just being collected for the sake of being collected. Today, the states are taking on a lot of those roles. So California started first with this California Consumer Protection Act, and that's called CCPA. Shortly after that, New York came out with the New York State Shield Act. And essentially it's the Stop Hacks and Improve Electronic Data Security Act. And the purpose of this, and both of them take on very GDPR-esque rules and guidelines. They kind of modeled them after GDPR. They're not identical, they're not specific. They don't have all of the bullet points, if you will, for GDPR, but they do model after GDPR pretty well. Something that's really important to understand is that state to state, the definitions under PII vary, which is strange because you would think that they would all be the same, but they actually modify definitions for things like biometrics, unique identifiers. Some are more broad than others. So thankfully in the library systems, you really just need to know what the rules and regulations are in the state of New York. But if you think about general business that does, especially businesses that have websites and work with, first of all, from state to state, but then also from country to country, it becomes a huge task to be able to understand what the roles and responsibilities are from state to state, or what the definition of PII is from state to state. So what a lot of organizations I'm seeing now are doing is really modeling after GDPR, because it is kind of is the gold standard of data privacy, and then hoping that they're going to be, anywhere from 85 to 90% covered with all the other regulations. But in the case of New York State Shield, it essentially talks about what businesses can do with private information about New York State residents. They must dictates that they must implement safeguards to protect the security, confidentiality, and integrity of stored private information. So that's really important, because this regulation isn't just about securing the information. It's about securing it, ensuring it's confidential, and then ensuring the integrity. And the integrity piece means that it can't be altered, right? So that's a lot of responsibility for an organization that's collecting data. So it's not just about, can the data be exfiltrated, but can it be altered? So that's really a lot of responsibility on organizations. And so we need to think about that now as this new layer of responsibility, even within the library system, because they're not just worried about data being stolen, they're worried about data being also altered. And so what controls do you have in place that will mitigate against somebody getting into a system and altering the data that's within your system? And then it defines private information as personal identifiers such as name, number, mark, or other identifiers that are combined with social security number, driver's ID, an account number, a credit card number, and biometric, or a username or email address in combination with a password or security question that would permit access to an account online. So as you can see, some of these things are not necessarily what we would think about in terms of PII, like an account number, it's an identifier. So we have to be able to link things to the individual. And then also that linkage has to also give someone or permit access to accounts online. So this whole series really has been on cybersecurity awareness, but these last two sessions have been really focused on data privacy. So I wanted to kind of talk about how the two overlap. And in a few slides forward, we'll also talk about organizational risk. But for now, let's just talk about cybersecurity risk and privacy risk. And what we need to recognize is that if we just focus on cybersecurity, we're going to actually miss out on some of the risk that you're going to incur for privacy. And why is that the case? Because when we look at cybersecurity, those are risks associated with cybersecurity incidents relating to the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. If you watched the very, very first session where we did Cybersecurity 101, the main core tenets of cybersecurity is protecting confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. And just to do a real quick recap, the confidentiality obviously is we want to keep it protected from people having access to information they're not supposed to have access to. Integrity means that nobody can come in and alter that information. And then availability means that we want to make sure that that information is available to the people who need access to it. But when we look at privacy risks, that doesn't necessarily fall under the purview of cybersecurity risks, because privacy risks are often associated with events arising from processing of data. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's some sort of cybersecurity incident. It doesn't even have to be a security incident. It could be the way that data is processed could actually create a privacy risk. So this whole new element of data processing exists under privacy that doesn't necessarily exist under cybersecurity. So I just wanted to make it evident and clear that if we just look at everything under the scope or the lens of cybersecurity, we may lose out on some of the controls or things that we need in place, policies, procedures, and training around privacy. Does anybody have any questions about that or feedback on it? Okay. So what role do you play in the data processing ecosystem? So if we understand that data is collected, managed, and stored by your library as part of a larger system of organizations, it kind of allows you to see that the risk expands often way beyond just your borders, right? Or just the services like within your facility, because there are sometimes connections between libraries, depending on the library, and educational institutions, dealing with research. You often will have connections with other government agencies. During the pandemic, there may have been libraries that were used as resources for whatever purposes, right? So it's important that we realize that the library is one piece of a greater data processing ecosystem. And when we engage with other organizations, including manufacturers and software providers and service providers, your attack vector becomes very, very large. And the privacy risk becomes large when we're allowing organizations or systems or service providers to have access to patron information, because now we have to know and be aware and astute of how is that information being protected on their other services or their other systems. So just remember, and again, this goes back to the conversation that we had in the last session, that we need to be really mindful of the organizations that we partner with and what access to information that they have, and then also ask the right questions about how they're going to be protecting that information and data. Because if you select a partnership, and it may or may not be a paid partnership, it could be a volunteer thing, it could be a partnership with another organization where patron information may be shared or used, and that information is leaked or garnered from some other third party and without the knowledge or understanding of the data subject, that could be a liability for your organization and could potentially be something that could be pursued legally. So just be mindful that the library system does share information with other organizations, and so knowing which pieces of information is being shared, especially if we're using a third party that provides additional resources for people to do research, or additional resources for people to be able to check things out virtually or digitally. How are they protecting that data? Because again, remember that idea of data privacy in a library setting extends way beyond PII, right? So that what inquiries they're making, the research people are doing, we want to make sure that that's all protected. So I did want to talk a little bit about what a data protection policy is versus a data privacy policy. So when we think about data protection policies, that is an internal document that outlines the controls and processes that are in place within your organization to prevent data leaks. And it goes specifically around the processing piece. How is information received by the data subject? Who processes it? Who has access to it? And then what are we doing to prevent that information from being leaked? And think of it beyond digital. So I think I used this example once before, but we at Mamacating, we did a sign-up sheet because we had some extra monitors and other computer equipment that we wanted to donate back to the community. And so people were able to sign themselves up, but they were also able to sign other people that they thought were in need of this equipment. That's semi-sensitive information, right? So we want to make sure that once the list is utilized and it's documented who we provided those assets to, we now shred the document. We shouldn't keep that information longer than we need to have it, right? Because it's been written down somewhere and it's information that's about patrons. So we want to make sure we have policies and procedures in place for the internal handling of data, and that way we make sure that it's controlled. A data privacy policy is actually the external facing document that explains to your patrons how you are collecting, using, and processing their data, and why you're doing that, and how long you're doing it for, right? And who you're sharing it with. So that's really the disclosure to the external world about what you're doing with their data. So does anybody have any questions about the data protection policy versus a data privacy policy? Because they're very, very separate things. And the protection policy is actually going to demonstrate the internal policies and procedures and controls that are going to be used to protect the data. Whereas the data privacy policy is the disclosure of that information to the data subjects. Does that make sense? Great. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a privacy impact assessment. I think that it's really interesting. Some organizations they do a lot of different types of assessments, mostly around cybersecurity, but they don't necessarily do a privacy impact assessment. So I wanted to give this to everybody as just thought-provoking, maybe something that you would want to conduct within your library system. Because I feel like it's a tool that can identify and mitigate privacy risks. I did not make this up. This is not my intellectual property. This is actually something that NIST has for its National Institute of Standards, Technology Standards. Standards and Technology. They post this as something for government agencies to do, but I try to talk with all organizations about it because I think it's a really great tool. It's easy to do, and it helps you to identify risks that you may be incurring and you didn't even know about it. So the purpose of a privacy impact assessment is to identify what PII, if any, is actually being collected, identify the why this information is being collected, and then identify how the PII is collected, the how, right? How is it collected, used, processed, protected, and stored? Now, in the case of the libraries, we need to expand that, again, beyond just PII, but also to include the activities of the patron that are protected based on the guidelines of the American Library Association. So that included all of those things that I named in the beginning. And then once you complete this assessment, which shouldn't take long unless you're doing some really crazy things with sensitive information, it shouldn't take long. Once you've identified the critical systems that store sensitive information, you now can start to think about, okay, are we conforming with the privacy laws and regulations of the state of New York? Do we know what the risks and effects of the collection of this information actually poses to our library? Sometimes you go to various different, doctors or anywhere, and they make you fill out a form for like when you first show up, and they ask you the same question 16 times, and it's on 16 different handwritten pages. And I always thought about, why would you ask that information 16 times in 16 different pages when it could just be all kind of put into one area, and then because it's so much more difficult to protect that same piece of sensitive information in all these different locations. So it gives you the opportunity to identify where's the PII, how many times are we collecting that same information, and how many places is it stored? Can we consolidate that so that it's less of a risk, it's less of an attack surface? It gives you a really good kind of mapping of where these data sets are. And then it also allows you to evaluate the protections and processes that are in place to mitigate privacy risks. So like I said, if you're collecting information and storing it in 4 different places, and you identify, well, if I only store it in one place, that means I only have to invest in one set of controls around this one, repository, then you're saving money and you're saving resources. So taking a little bit of time out to identify these things might actually allow you to be more efficient and cut costs, because you realize, okay, I don't need to store this same data in sets in 5 different places. We can consolidate it to 1 or 2. So conducting a privacy impact assessment may be something that would be helpful for your library, especially if you've never really done that before, where you haven't necessarily identified all the locations of sensitive patron and employee information and library information, financial documents and things like that. It might be something that would be worth doing. And also remember, don't just look at the digital assets. Look at where do you have things that are handwritten and stored in filing cabinets? Are those cabinets in locked areas, and are the cabinets themselves locked, right? So remember, and who has access to the keys and all those things. Conducting this kind of assessment is actually really helpful to kind of give you a better understanding of what the threat landscape and the risks are for your organization. Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay. So I wanted to add another layer in there, because we talked about the relationship between cybersecurity risk and privacy risk, but we also want to talk about the relationship between privacy risk and organizational risk. So if you remember, we talked about privacy data privacy really revolves around the processing from data. So if we have a problem that's arisen from this data processing area, what ends up happening is that we have a direct impact on the individual, right? So it could be perceived as embarrassment, discrimination, or some sort of loss, right? Economic loss or otherwise. And that is now going to result in a serious impact on your organization in terms of compliance issues. You might end up incurring fines. It could have harm to the reputation of your organization, or even kind of an internal culture issue. In terms of customer abandonment, especially in a library system, the one thing I've recognized being a trustee of the library, and I just never really understood the relationship until I was had a peek underneath the hood, but people who use library resources are very emotionally involved with the library and the services that they provide. And the one mistake that you make, they're going to make sure you know about it. They're really keen on complaining about these things. And so if one of your patrons ends up experiencing one of these situations where some of their data has been leaked or put out there because of a processing issue, it could be a major headache for the library because the patron, probably has access to all sorts of means to let that get out, right? So it could be detrimental also to the morale within the library if they're the people that are now being the targets of the patrons who are upset because their data has, there's been a problem with how their data has been handled. So we've got the cybersecurity risk, we've got privacy risk, and then the risk to the overall organization and the operations of the organization. So I hope that helps, just to give you kind of a large 10,000-foot view of why privacy protections are important and how they need to go beyond just your traditional cybersecurity protections, because it really is the process piece that is key. So this slide was from the first session, but I thought it was worth repeating. So I wanted to do a quick review of the do's and don'ts, right? So when we talk about vendors, we want to make sure that we work with vendors that store and process sensitive information and ensure the protection of that information. So we want to make sure that there's an agreement, a written agreement between you and the vendor. And then we also want to make sure that roles and responsibilities of those protections are outlined within that agreement. Get informed consent prior to collection. Informed consent is the key here, is that we need to make sure that people understand what information we're collecting and why we are collecting it. Because at the end of the day, we don't want somebody to be able to come back and say, oh, I didn't know that that's what they were doing. I didn't know that that's why they wanted that information. So gaining the informed consent is going to go a very, very long way in terms of liability. Only collect the data that you need to do the task. You don't want to collect data, and again, these kind of go back and forth, but you don't want to collect data just for the sake of like, hey, we may need that later, right? I may have shared this story in the past, but when I was in sales, for example, a good salesperson remembers very specific things about their customers, like their birthday and how many kids they have and what college their kids go to and their favorite sports teams. And we used a tool called Salesforce. And I used to go into the notes section, which is clear text, not encrypted, and put all of this very private, sensitive information about my customers in there because I was being a good salesperson. As I started going to school and becoming more educated about privacy and cybersecurity, I realized that is a big no-no. You don't put somebody's personal and private information into a system that wasn't designed necessarily to collect that information, number one. And number two, if I didn't get their consent to document that information in our Salesforce, that could be a serious liability as well if that information gets out. It's got very private information about those individuals. So do not collect data or store data about individuals or patrons that you do not need. Just only collect what you need in order to do the task. And then the kind of flip side of that is only store the data for as long as you need it. So within your data protection policy, you should also have some sort of caveat for your retention of data. How long do you need to keep data? Once you have that retention parameter set, you need to enforce that. So if you're saying that you're only collecting data for 5 years after a patron is no longer active, then make sure after 5 years that their information is purged out of your system. And I just made that up. It doesn't have to be 5. It could be 1. It could be whatever it is. But if you create a policy that includes retention, you want to make sure that it's being enforced. And then, of course, the don'ts. We do not want to automatically opt patrons into data collection. We want that informed. We want them to be able to opt out upfront, right? We don't want them to be automatically opted in. And when we do not want to collect obviously sensitive data just in case. And then we do not want to store sensitive data indefinitely. We want to set those parameters. So now that we've kind of talked about cybersecurity risk, privacy risk, organizational risk, I wanted to show you in this diagram how all of these things really build on trust relationships. So when we think about privacy in particular as it relates to cybersecurity, data confidentiality and integrity are the two big ones, right? So we want to make sure that the information is held confidential, that we use the controls that are required through cybersecurity means to create that protection around it. And from a privacy perspective, we want to make sure that as that information is being processed, that we are also implementing different design features and procedures to ensure that the privacy is maintained during processing. And then all of that really creates this trust. We are going to make sure that the software and systems that we're using are going to be updated, and they are going to be, that the manufacturers are writing the systems with integrity. There's not going to be backdoors, and all of these things really builds out this ecosystem of trust for your patrons, in this case, your employees, and also any other organization that's going to partner with your library system. So the final key takeaways from this session is that privacy is an important issue to be considered when collecting and processing patron and employee information. We want to make sure that when we're going to do this, that we take it seriously and we kind of identify all of the risks that come into play when we're collecting and storing information about others. Data privacy risks go beyond cybersecurity risks. So we cannot just take the mindset of, oh, well, we've got this cybersecurity program in place, so that's going to cover our data privacy needs. They definitely overlap for sure, as we demonstrated today, but you absolutely cannot assume that all of your data privacy needs are going to be met through cybersecurity means. So you need to identify the different things separately and then really map out what controls, additional controls and processes that you need to protect data privacy. Know where your organization fits in the data processing ecosystem. So remember, you're not an island, you're sharing information, there's integrations between systems. Where are those integrations vulnerable, and what are the identify where data could potentially be leaked or compromised. Make sure your privacy policy is clear and readily available for the public, but also make sure your data protection privacy aligns with your privacy policy. So if you're telling your patrons that you're doing X, Y, and Z, you need to make sure that the controls are in place in order to do what you say you're going to do, right? So we want to make sure that the two align. And then, of course, cybersecurity, privacy, and trust all dovetail into one another. There's, this really great relationship between the three of them. And if you really identify privacy risks and cybersecurity risks, you are going to be able to create a really strong trust relationship with the individuals, either that work within your organization, but also the patrons and any other partnerships that you may have. And that concludes our final session of the cybersecurity awareness training. Again, my contact information is here. If you ever need to get in touch with me, by all means. I do these talks for individual libraries. I've done, one session for a library down in Rockland. I'd be more than happy to work with any of your organizations if you think that your employees need a little bit additional training. I will stop sharing and I will stop the recording. If anybody